Hi, in the last video I showed you how to do the long tail cast on. In this video I would like to show you how to do some extra things to help make your long tail cast on look a little bit better and maybe a little bit easier to execute. One of the first things that we'll discuss is how to determine what the length of your tail should be. This is something that frustrates a lot of new knitters. Now of course you already know that you need to have a tail, and you just need to know where to start it. Well, there is a trick to figuring this out. All you need is the knitting needle that you're going to cast on with and your yarn. You take your yarn and you're always going to have that tail end, the end that you're going to weave in. I shouldn't say the tail, the part of the tail that you're weave in. 4, 5, 6 inches, whatever it may be that you feel comfortable with leaving to weave in. Generally 5 is about right. So you're going to take your yarn and you'll just hang it over your knitting needle with the part that you'll weave in hanging on one side and the rest of the yarn running to the ball coming from the other side. Then just take your yarn and wrap it around your knitting needle, and the number of times that you wrap your yarn around the knitting needle represents the number of stitches that you can cast on for that length. Basically it's creating the length that you need. So if your directions tell you that you need to cast on 10 stitches, you'll simply wrap your yarn around your knitting needle a total of 10 times. Not too tight, not too loose, just wrap them around. Then pinch the yarn at that point and remove the knitting needle. Between the end that you determine needs to be your weave-in end and the distance between the two fingers now, that's what should be used to cast on 10 stitches. Now if you need to cast on, let's say 20 stitches, you can easily just take this length and double it. That should be equal to the length that you need for 20 stitches. For 30 stitches, you'll take it again, and so on and so on and so on. And you can do that all the way up to as many as you need. For a higher number, like say 100, I would probably actually recommend wrapping your yarn around your knitting needle, say 20 times, and then using that length for 20 as your guide, just because it'll be a little bit closer, because sometimes when you pull it out you stretch and whatnot and it gets a little bit off. But for the most part, that's a very accurate way of estimating what your length will be, and a lot less frustrating than getting to the end of your cast on and determining that your tail yarn is like 3 stitches too short. The next thing we're going to talk about is the knitting needle that you're actually going to cast on with. Now if your project says to cast on with say a size 5 knitting needle, what I'd recommend is casting on with a size 8 knitting needle, especially for a beginner. There's one little advanced thing that I'm going to discuss after this. But if you cast on with a larger size knitting needle, it's going to automatically give you a looser cast on. And most of the time the directions will tell you to cast on loosely. And if you've ever tried casting on loosely, you'll know that the stitches just never quite look right. There's always something wrong with them, some part that you're not happy with, and especially if you're casting on 40 or 50 stitches, you certainly don't want to undo it and keep recasting on. So if you just cast on with a knitting needle that is 2 or 3 sizes larger than what your project needs, and then after you cast on, switch back to your smaller knitting needle that you need for your project, voila, fix that problem. Okay, one more problem that we seem to encounter with a long tail cast on is many times when you cast on, that very last stitch, when you go to knit it, it always tends to be a little bit too loose, and you're just not really satisfied with it. You knit it and it looks okay, and when you come back to it on the next row, you're like, huh, well that doesn't work very well. Okay, so this is how you can pretty that up. You can pretty it up by using a cast on that with 2 knitting needles. So basically all you're doing in this case is you're taking the circumference of one that's already larger than what you needed, and you're dividing it into 2. Now, which size knitting needles that you'll use obviously is going to depend upon what you have in your stash. For the size 5 knitting needle, I've decided to use a size 3 and a size 6, which doesn't really equal 9 because it just doesn't. So what you do is the first 2 stitches that you'll cast on are going to be cast onto the smaller knitting needle. And then you'll incorporate the larger knitting needle. You're just going to sit that right on top of the small one and then keep working the stitches across. until you come to the number of stitches minus 2 that you need. The last 2 stitches you'll put onto the small needle again. Then when you go to knit it, all you do is pull out the knitting needle that has the least number of stitches on it, and then begin knitting like you normally would into the stitches. Now as you'll see here that these are really loose, but they're also sitting on a size 3 knitting needle. If you took those and you put them onto the size that you really need, I'm just going to let those other guys hang off there, it's not really all that loose anymore. And all you do is just start knitting into the smaller one all the way through, and that's going to take care of that extra loose end that you get at the very end of your cast on. I hope that these little tips and extra tidbits have helped you in making your long tail cast on look even better.